Today our lecture is on social justice and human rights. I'm Fahmeeda Rahman, the lecturer and program coordinator at BRAC University. So to talk about social justice and human rights, I'll be covering a few questions. And the questions are, question 1, what are human rights and what has been the evolution of human rights concept? Question 2, have claims of human rights violation been used to advance economic protectionism? Question 3, is rationing healthcare facilities really considering the urgency of social justice? So you see, the concept of human rights is a vast concept, is a vast term. It could be explained from the viewpoints of law, could be explained from political science, it could be explained from the views of sociologically, anthropologically, and also from a very general views. So anthropologically speaking, human rights, according to Lean Hunt, is about an unusual form of moral currency. Trumping wealth, social status, friendship, and other particularities are all the person simply an account of common humanity. So what Lean Hunt did is she took the concept of human rights a bit further. The central to her account is the role of feeling and emotion is more important on human rights. For example, when a person becomes aware that there is a human right issue, he or she is horrified by the violation because it's a feeling or emotion working that there has been something wrong with his or her human rights and social justice. Now, according to Hannah Arendt, to enjoy human rights, one must have status as a legal person that is obtained through political status of citizenship. Now, what does that give us? By having a political status of citizenship, we have the right to have rights. By having the right to have rights, we belong to some kind of organized community. We have the right to live in a framework where one is judged by one's actions and opinions. We have the right to vote. We have the right to speak freely, and the list goes on. So the concept of human rights was announced right after the Second World War by the UN General Assembly. And it began by recognizing, and I will quote, "The inherent dignity of all members of human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, peace, and the world." Now let's look at some of the examples of what are the human rights issues that's going on locally and globally. So one is, and since we are a bit short in time, I would just cover a very few, 2 from locals and 1 from global. The 2 of the local issues that I'll be covering, and which is according to the World Report of 2020, is one is the indigenous rights and the other is the women's right and child's protection. So talking about indigenous right, you see Chittagong Hill Tracts till today faces massive violence from police. They're being arrested, they're being molested and whatnot. And a great example is of Michael Chakma, who's an indigenous rights activist. So you see, he went missing one day while he was traveling from his home to Dhaka, and it has been quite a year. So even after the High Court has ordered to give a full report of why he went missing and what's an update, there has been no response yet. Now moving on to the second one, the women's right and child protection. You see, Bangladesh has the highest rate of child marriage till now, and now there is a special provision in case going on which is called the special marriage. However, even though it was declared that from May 21 that the entire child marriage will be abolished, but what happened is now there's a special condition given, which means even though we are trying to abolish child marriage, however, we have put a questionable yes to it as well. And adding up to it, the women's security and child security is also in question because of all the recent assaulted report that we are covering or we are seeing in the social media, the newspapers and journals and whatnot. Now moving on to the global issues, I will talk about the sexual orientation and gender identity. The development of Health and Human Services plan to roll back a federal rule clarifying that the Affordable Care Act's prohibition on sex discrimination includes discrimination based on gender identity as well. So in 2018, which is like 2-3 years back, a few states enacted laws permitting adoption and foster care providers assuring a religious objection to refuse to place children to those who are LGBT. Again, 19 states have laws expressly banning discrimination-based identity in employment, housing, and public accommodation. You see, therefore, human rights can be very diverse. It could be as diverse as the treatment of prisoners in US, in the jails of US, to the access to antiretroviral drugs to treat HIV, or the instructions of using the mother tongue in education institutions or at workspace. Now, moving on to the second question about economic protectionism, I would be covering John Rawls' theory and providing an example of the African security extractive sectors. So, what John Rawls did, he divided justice as fairness and addressed two principles. The first principle is equal basic liberties, which means that it embodies in the political constitutions. Therefore, all citizens should have familiar basic rights and liberties that must not be traded off against the other social goods. There are also fair value of political liberties, which contains the right to hold public office, the right to hold public office, right to affect the outcome of national elections, and so on. Now, for the second principle, there are two conditions. The one is fair equality of opportunity, and the second is the difference principle. So, fair equality of opportunity means, like for example, the right to have the same kind of educational and economic facilities or opportunities, even though when we do not belong to the same economic or social background or classes. The difference principle is about regulating the distribution of wealth and income. It allows inequalities of wealth and income that leads to larger social products. It uses the different talents of all the citizens that live together in a country or state to have a better life for everyone else. Therefore, in a society that satisfies the difference principle, citizens are always aware that their economy works for the betterment of their life. Now, Rawls' concept of justice for on human rights is simply that citizens are free, they are equal, and that society should be fair. Now, to add up or to sum up, the citizens are more rational and reasonable. So, now let's move on to the example of the case of the community-based security for Africa's the extractive sector. And we'll be looking at some of the major points, and I broke them down into few. So the first thing is the major security threats facing the extractive sector in the countries are securing the installations of oil and gas infrastructures, which is a very major threat. Now, making sure that the stakeholders' investments are also protected. And in order to do this, what the government does, they have taken the responsibility to themselves for securing the land or property that has gold or other minerals in them. Now, let's look at the actors who are involved in managing these securities, and these are the local civil society organizations, the private sector companies, and the state actors or the local politicians. So what they do, they decide which security forces will be in act and which will be in not. As a result, this becomes an issue as well. While giving security, the government usually supports the local providers. Now, sometimes a mining company or oil or gas company might hire a large transnational security providers that subcontract services to local companies. Now, what gets overlooked in this whole process is the number of African security companies that are being involved or that are trying to boom their business. And now, so there is a challenge as well. The challenge is how to best interact with these security providers while there are lots of political, personal, and bureaucratic dynamics at play. So you see the security governance affecting the communities involved. The issues that are mentioned, which is the lack of transparency. Extractive sector communities, they do not report in cases of, they do not know whom to report in cases of emergencies. And and one of the best examples for this to explain is in Ghana, even the sartorial of the security providers creates a confusion because the public and the private security forces have got the same kind of sartorials. So this is a huge confusion because in case of any kinds of human rights issue, the locals really don't know which security groups will act or security provider the perpetrator represents. So you see, the resource extraction and providing them to the locals is the key, where the government wants some credits for being able to improve the economy. However, local residents are a bit vigilant in giving government the whole credit. So there are international norms to inform the difference in understandings of private sectors and the corporation requiring these services. From one of the various laws and documents, the most highlighted one is the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And the reason behind this is because the smaller companies are well aware that they are not under the limelight until unless they're not brought by any larger companies. Therefore, they are less likely to put any kind of value or actively committing to promoting principles and norms of human security and good governance in their operations. So this shows that the economic protectionism of the community-based extractive sectors becomes a question, especially due to all the international norms and the government that's being played and all the related bureaucratic acts that's going on. Okay. So now let's move on to the third question, which is rationing healthcare facilities, considering whether they're really considering the urgency of social justice. And the best example to answer this is the very recent issue of COVID-19. So we are all aware of the disarray brought by COVID-19 in the world. And after a whole year and more of lockdown, what we have noticed is that people have lost jobs, family members have lost family members, and as a result, there has been a whole economic degradation not in countries, but in the entire world as well. But there are few questions that still remains, even though we did get a ray of hope as the vaccines are out, which is produced by the two of the biggest companies, the Pfizer and the Moderna. And the question that are still there out and not answered are, who gets these vaccines first? Which countries gets it faster and which country gets it later? Which actors or which groups are more eligible for the vaccines and which groups are less eligible for the vaccines? Who are answering these questions, or who are deciding the answers to these questions? Who are the governing body that's actually thinking that this is how the vaccination process should take place? And the reason that this is an urgency of social justice is because even though to mitigate health inequalities and promote social justice, the COVID vaccines needs to reach out. But there are people who are very, very vulnerable to or prone to be exposed to environmental threats. So where the world is in dire need of these vaccines, there are still a question of a supply and a demand for the vaccines as well. So a report has said that by May 21, the US will be able to give vaccinations to everyone who wants a shot. Again, the questions that I have asked before are still remaining unanswered, and hence the social justice is also questionable because the urgency is at stake and the process is still a very slow one. So I will actually sum up now, and by summing up, I would say that social justice is all about working towards a more equal society. It ensures that people are treated with dignity and respect. So human rights are not just about values. They're set out in law, and they set out rules on how a person should live their life and how we should treat individuals. Therefore, human rights could be a very powerful tool that enables us to achieve a social justice. So this is it from my end, talking a very, very, very small part of social justice and human rights, and I hope you did understand what I wanted to convey. And thank you all for listening to the lecture. you.